Alright, we are back for the final installment of Chapter 3, Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. We are at page 142 at the very top. Let's get into it. Florentino Ariza endured the hardships of the journey with the mineral patience that had brought sorrow to his mother and exasperation to his friends. He spoke to no one. The days were easy for him as he sat at the rail watching the motionless alligators sunning themselves on sandy banks, their mouths open to catch butterflies, watching the flocks of startled herons that rose without warning from the marshes, the manatees that nursed their young at large maternal teats and startled the passengers with their woman's cries. On a single day he saw 3 bloated green human corpses float past with buzzards sitting on them. First, the bodies of 2 young men went by, one of them without a head, and then a very young girl whose Medusan locks undulated in the boat's wake. He never knew, because no one ever knew if they were victims of cholera or the war, but the nauseating stench contaminated his memory of Fermina. That was always the case. Any event, good or bad, had some relationship to her. At night, when the boat was anchored and most of the passengers walked the decks in despair, he perused illustrated novels he knew almost by heart under the carbine lamp in the dining room, which was the only one kept burning until dawn, and the dramas he had read so often regained their original magic when he replaced the imaginary protagonist with the people he knew in real life, reserving for himself and Fermina the roles of star-crossed lovers. On the other nights, he wrote anguished letters and then scattered their fragments over the water and flowed toward her without pause. And so the most difficult hours passed for him, at times in the person of a timid prince or a paladin of love, and other times in his own scalded hide of a lover in the middle of forgetting, until the first breezes began to blow and he went to doze in the lounge chairs by the railing. One night, when he stopped his reading earlier than usual and was walking distracted toward the toilets, a door opened as he passed the dining room, and a hand like the talon of a hawk seized him by the shirt sleeve and pulled him into a cabin. In the darkness, he could barely see the naked woman, her ageless body soaked in hot perspiration, her breathing heavy, who pushed him onto the bunk face up, unbuckled his belt, unbuttoned his trousers, impaled herself on him, and she, as if she were riding horseback, and stripped him without glory of his virginity. Both of them fell in an agony of desire into the void of a bottomless pit that smelled of salt marsh full of prawns. Then she lay for a moment on top of him, gasping for breath, and she ceased to exist in the darkness. "I'll go and forget all about it," she said. This never happened. The assault had been so rapid and so triumphant that it could only be understood not as a sudden madness caused by boredom, but as the fruit of a plan elaborated over time and down to its smallest detail. This gratifying certainty increased Florentino Ariza's eagerness. For at the height of pleasure, he had experienced a revelation that he could not believe, that he refused to admit, which was that his illusory love for Fermina could be replaced by an earthly passion. And so it was that he felt compelled to discover the identity of the mistress of violation, in whose panther's instinct he might find the cure for his misfortune. But he was not successful. On the contrary, the more delved into the search, the further he felt from the truth. The assault had taken place in the last cabin, but this communicated with the one next to it by a door, so that the 2 doors had been converted into family sleeping quarters with 4 bunks. The occupants were 2 young women, another who was rather mature but very attractive, and an infant a few months old. They had boarded in Barranco de Loba, the port where cargo and passengers from Mompox were picked ever since that city had been excluded from the itineraries of the steamboats because of the river's caprices, and Florentino Ariza had noticed them only because they carried the sleeping child in a large bird cage. They dressed as if they were traveling on a fashionable ocean liner, with bustles under their silk shirts and lace gorgets, and broad-brimmed hats trimmed with crinoline flowers, and the 2 younger women changed their entire outfits several times a day, so that they seemed to carry with them their own spring-like ambience when the other passengers were suffocating in the heat. All 3 were skilled in the use of parasols and feathered fans, but their intentions were as indecipherable as those of other women from Mompox. Florentino Ariza could not even determine their relationship to one another, though he had no doubt they came from the same family. At first he thought the older one might be the mother of the other 2, but then he realized she was not old enough for that, and that she also wore partial mourning that the others did not share. He could not imagine that one of them would have dared to do what she did, while the others were sleeping in the nearby bunks, and the only reasonable supposition was that she had taken advantage of a fortuitous and perhaps prearranged moment when she was alone in the cabin. He observed that at times 2 of them stayed out for a breath of cool air until very late, while the third remained behind, caring for the infant. But one night, when it was very hot, all 3 of them left the cabin, carrying the baby, who was asleep in the wicker cage covered with gauze. Despite the tangle of clues, Florentino Ariza soon rejected the possibility that the oldest had been the perpetrator of the assault, and with as much dispatch he also absolved the youngest, who was the most beautiful and the boldest of the 3. He did so without valid reasons, but only because his avid observations of the 3 women had persuaded him to accept as truth the profound hope that his sudden lover was in fact the mother of the caged infant. The supposition was so seductive that he began to think of her with more intensity than he thought about Fermina Daza, ignoring the evidence that his recent mother lived only for her child. She was no more than 25. She was slender and golden. She had Portuguese eyelids that made her seem even more aloof, and any man would have been satisfied with only the crumbs of the tenderness that she lavished on her son. From breakfast until bedtime, she was busy with him in the salon, while the other 2 played Chinese checkers, and when at last she managed to put him to sleep, she would hang the wicker cage from the ceiling on the cooler side of the railing. She did not ignore him, however, even when he was asleep, but would rock the cage, singing love songs under her breath while her thoughts flew high above the miseries of the journey. Florentino Ariza clung to the illusion that sooner or later she would betray herself, if only with a gesture. He observed the changes in her breathing, watching the reliquary that hung on her batiste blouse, and he looked at her without dissimulation over the book he pretended to read, and committed the calculated impertinence of changing his seat in the dining room so that he would face her. But he could not find the slightest hint that she was in fact the repository of the other half of his secret. The only thing of hers he had, and the only because her younger companion called to her, was her first name, Rosalba. And bottom of 144. On the 8th day, the boat navigated with great difficulty through a turbulent strait squeezed between marble cliffs, and after lunch it anchored in Puerto Nare. It was the disembarkation point for those passengers who had continued their journey into Antioquia, one of the provinces most affected by the new civil war. The port consisted of half a dozen palm huts and a store made of wood with a zinc roof, and protected by several squads of barefoot and ill-armed soldiers, because there had been rumors of a plan of the insurrectionists to plunder the boats. Behind the houses, reaching to the sky, rose a promontory of uncultivated highland with a wrought iron cornice at the edge of the precipice. No one on board slept well that night, but the attack did not materialize, and in the morning the port was transformed into a Sunday fair, with Indians selling tagua amulets and love potions amid packs of animals, ready to begin the 6-day ascent to the orchid jungles of the central mountain range. Florentino Ariza passed the time watching black men unload the boat onto their backs. He watched them carry off crates of china and pianos for the spinsters of Envigado, and he did not realize until it was too late that Rosalba and her party were among the passengers who stayed on shore. He saw them when they were already sitting side saddle with their Amazon's boots and their parasols in equatorial colors, and then he took the step that he had not dared to take during the preceding days. He waved goodbye to Rosalba, and the 3 women responded in kind, with a familiarity that cut him to the quick because his boldness came too late. He saw them round the corner of the store, followed by the mules carrying their trunks, their hat boxes, and the baby's cage, and soon afterwards he saw them descend along the edge of the precipice like a line of ants and disappear from his life. Then he felt alone in the world, and the memory of Fermina Daza lying in ambush in recent days dealt him a mortal blow. He knew she was to have an elaborate wedding, and then the being who loved her most would love her forever, would not even have the right to die for her. Jealousy, which until that time had been drowning and weeping, took possession of his soul. He prayed to God that the lightning of divine justice would strike Fermina Daza as she was about to give her vow of love and obedience to a man who wanted her for his wife only as a social adornment, and when he went into rapture at the vision of the bride, his bride or no one's lying face up on the flagstones of the cathedral, her orange blossoms laden with the dew of death, and the foaming torrent of her veil covering the funerary marbles of the 14 bishops who were buried in front of the main altar. Once his revenge was consummated, however, he repented of his own wickedness, and then he saw Fermina Daza rising from the ground, her spirit intact, distant but alive, because it was not possible for him to imagine the world without her. He did not sleep again, and if at times he sat down to pick at food, it was in the hope that Fermina Daza would be at the table, or conversely, to deny her the homage of fasting for her sake, or the homage of fasting for her sake. At times his solace was the certainty that during the intoxication of her wedding celebration, even during the feverish nights of her honeymoon, Fermina Daza would suffer one moment, one at least, but one in any event, when the phantom of the sweetheart she had scorned, humiliated, and insulted would appear in her thoughts, and all her happiness would be destroyed. The night before they reached the port of Caracoli, which was the end of the journey, the captain gave the traditional farewell party with a woodwind orchestra composed of crew members and fireworks on the bridge. The minister from Great Britain had survived the Odyssey with exemplary stoicism, shooting with his camera the animals they would not allow him to kill with his rifles, and not a night went by that he was not seen in evening dress in the dining room. But he came to the final party wearing the tartans of McTavish clan, and he played the bagpipe for everyone's entertainment, and taught those who were interested how to dance his national dances. And before daybreak, he almost had to be carried to his cabin. Florentino Riza, prostrate with grief, had gone to the farthest corner of the deck where the noise of the revelry could not reach him, and he put on Littorio Thuga's overcoat in an effort to overcome the shivering in his bones. He had awakened at 5 that morning, and the condemned man awakens at dawn on the day of his execution, and for the entire day he had done nothing but imagine, minute by minute, each of the events at Fermina Daza's wedding. Later, when he returned home, he realized that he had made a mistake in the time that he had, and that everything he had. When he returned home, he realized that he had made a mistake in the time, and that everything had been different from what he had imagined, and he even had the good sense to laugh at his fantasy. There we go. But in any case, it was a Saturday of passion, which culminated in a new crisis of fever, when he thought the moment had come for the newlyweds to flee in secret through a false door to give themselves over to the delights of their first night. Someone saw him shivering with fever and informed the captain, who was fearing a case of cholera, left the party with a ship's doctor, and the doctor took the precautions of sending Florentino to the quarantine cabin with a dose of bromides. The next day, however, when they sighted the cliffs of Caracoli, his fever had disappeared, and his spirits were elated, because in the marasmus of the sedatives, he had resolved once and for all that he did not give a damn about the brilliant future of the telegraph, and that he would take this very same boat to the old street of windows. It was not difficult to persuade them to give him return passage in exchange for the cabin that he had surrendered to the representative of Queen Victoria. The captain also attempted to dissuade him, arguing that the telegraph was the science of the future, so much so, he said, that they were already devising a system for installing it on boats. But he resisted all arguments, and in the end the captain took him home, not because he owed him the price of the cabin, but because he knew of his excellent connections to the river company of the Caribbean. The trip downriver took less than 6 days, and Florentino Riza felt that he was home again from the moment they entered Mercedes Lagoon at dawn, and he saw the trail of lights on the fishing canoes undulating in the wake of the boat. It was still dark when they docked in Niño Perdido Cove, 9 leagues from the bay, and the last port of riverboats until the old Spanish Channel was dredged and put back into service. The passengers would have to wait until 6 o'clock in the morning to board the fleet of sloops for hire that would carry them to their final destination. But Florentino Riza was so eager that he sailed much earlier on the mail sloop, whose crew acknowledged him as one of their own. Before he left the boat, he succumbed to the temptation of a symbolic act. He threw his patat into the water and followed it with his eyes as it floated past the beacon of lights of the invisible fisherman, left the lagoon, and disappeared in the ocean. He was sure he would not need it again for all the days of his life. Never again, because never again would he abandon the city of Fermina Daza. The bay was calm at daybreak. Above the floating mist, Florentino Ariza saw the dome of the cathedral, guided by the first light of dawn, and he saw the dovecotes on the flat roofs, and orienting himself by them, he located the balcony of the palace of the Marquis de Casaladuerdo, and he supposed that the lady of his misfortune was still dozing, her head on the shoulder of her satiated husband. That idea broke his heart, but he did nothing to suppress it. On the contrary, he took pleasure in his pain. The sun was beginning to grow hot as the mail sloop made its way through the labyrinth of sailing ships that lay at anchor, where the countless odors from the public market and the decaying matter on the bottom of the bay blended into one pestilential stench. The schooner from Riohacha had just arrived, and gangs of stevedores in water up to their waists lifted the passengers over the side and carried them to shore. Florentino was the first to jump on land from the mail sloop, and from that time on he had no longer detected the fetid reek of the bay in the city, but was aware only of the personal fragrance of Fermina Daza. Everything smelled of her. He did not return to the telegraph office. His only interest seemed to be the sterilized love novels and volumes of the popular library that his mother continued to buy for him, and that he continued to read again and again, lying in his hammock until he learned them by heart. He did not even ask for his violin. He re-established relations with his closest friends, and sometimes they played billiards or conversed in the outdoor cafes under the arches around the plaza of the cathedral, but he did not go back to the Saturday night dances. He could not conceive of them without her. On the morning of his return from his inconclusive journey, he learned that Fermina Daza was spending her honeymoon in Europe, and it agitated his heart. And his agitated heart took it for granted that she would live there, if not forever, then for many years to come. This certainty filled him with his first hope of forgetting. He thought of Rosalba, whose memory burned brighter as the other dimmed. It was during this time that he grew a mustache with the wax tips that he would keep for the rest of his life that changed his entire being, and the idea of substituting one love for another carried him along surprising paths. Little by little, the fragrance of Fermina Daza became less frequent and less intense, and at last it remained only in white gardenias. Top of 149. One night during the war, when he was drifting, not knowing what direction his life should take, the celebrated Widow Nazareth took refuge in his house because hers had been destroyed by cannon fire during the siege by the rebel general Ricardo Gaitan Obeso. It was Transito Arizo who took control of the situation and sent the widow to her son's bedroom on the pretext that there was no space in hers, but actually in the hope that another love would cure him of the one that did not allow him to live. Florentino Ariza had not made love ever since he lost his virginity to Rosalba in the cabin on the boat, and in this emergency it seemed natural to him that the widow should sleep in the bed, and he in the hammock. But she had already made the decision for him. She sat on the edge of the bed where Florentino Ariza was lying, not knowing what to do, and she began to speak to him of her inconsolable grief for the husband who had died 3 years earlier, and in the meantime she removed her widow's weeds and tossed them in the air until she was not even wearing her wedding ring. She took off the taffeta blouse with the beaded embroidery and threw it across the room onto the easy chair in the corner. She tossed her bodice over her shoulder to the other side of the bed. With one pull, she removed her long ruffled skirt, her satin garter belt, and funereal stockings, and she threw everything on the floor until the room was carpeted with the last remnants of her mourning. She did it with so much joy and such well-measured pauses that each of her gestures seemed to be saluted by the cannon of the attacking troops, which shook the city down to its foundations. Florentino Ariza tried to help her unfasten her stays, but she anticipated him with a deft maneuver, for in 5 years of matrimonial devotion, she learned to depend on herself in all phases of love, even the preliminary stages, with no help from anyone. Then she removed her lace panties, sliding them down her legs with the rapid movements of a swimmer, and at last she was naked. She was 28 years old and had given birth 3 times, but her naked body preserved intact the giddy excitement of an unmarried woman. Florentino Ariza was never to understand how a few articles of penitential clothing could have hidden the drives of that wild mare who, choking on her own feverish desire, undressed him as she had never been able to undress her husband, who would have thought her perverse, and tried, with the confusion and innocence of 5 years of conjugal fidelity, to satisfy in a single assault the iron abstinence of her mourning. Before that night, and from the hour of grace when her mother gave birth to her, she had never even been in the same bed with any other man than her dead husband. She did not permit herself the vulgarity of remorse. On the contrary, kept awake by the gunfire whizzing over the roofs, she continued to evoke her husband's excellent qualities until daybreak, not reproaching him for any disloyalty other than having died without her, which was mitigated by her conviction that he had never belonged to her as much as he did now, because he was in the coffin nailed shut with a dozen 3-inch nails and 2 meters under the ground. "I am happy," she said, "because only now do I know for certain where he is when he is not at home." That night she stopped wearing mourning once and for all, and without passing through the useless intermediate stages of blouses with little gray flowers, and her life was filled with love songs and provocative dresses decorated with macaws and spotted butterflies, and she began to share her body with anyone who cared to ask for it. When the troops of General Gaetano Beso were defeated after a 63-day siege, she rebuilt the house that had been damaged by cannon fire, adding a beautiful sea terrace that overlooked the breakwater where the surf would vent its fury during the stormy season. That was her love nest, as she called it, without irony, where she would receive only men she liked, when she liked, how she liked, and without changing one red cent, because, in her opinion, it was the men who were doing her the favor. In the very few cases she would accept a gift, as long as it was not made of gold, and she managed everything with so much skill that no one could have presented conclusive evidence of improper conduct. On only one occasion did she hover on the edge of public scandal, when the rumor circulated that the Archbishop Dante de Luna had not died by accident after eating a plate of poisonous mushrooms, but had eaten them intentionally because she threatened to expose him if he persisted in his sacrilegious solicitations. As she used to say between peals of laughter, she was the only free woman in the province. Love this gal. The Widow Nazareth never missed her occasional appointments with Florentino Ariza, not even during her busiest times, and it was always without present pretensions of loving or being loved, although always in the hope of finding something that resembled love, but without the problems of love. Sometimes he went to her house, and then they liked to sit on the sea terrace, drenched by salt spray, watching the dawn of the whole world on the horizon. With all its perseverance, he tried to teach her the tricks he had seen others perform through the peepholes in the transient hotel, along with theoretical formulations preached by Lothario Thugut on his nights of debauchery. He persuaded her to let themselves be observed while they made love, to replace the conventional missionary position with the bicycle on the sea, or the chicken on the grill, or the drawn and quartered angel, and they almost broke their necks when the cord snapped as they were trying to devise something new in the hammock. The lessons were to no avail. The truth is that she was a fearless apprentice, but lacked all talent for guided fornication. She never understood the charm of serenity in bed, never a moment of invention, and her orgasms were inopportune and epidermic and uninspired lay. For a long time, Florentino Ariza lived with the deception that he was the only one, and she humored him in that belief until she had the bad luck to talk in her sleep. Little by little, listening to her sleep, he pieced together the navigation chart of her dreams and sailed among the countless islands of her secret life. In this way, he learned that she did not want to marry him, but did not feel joined to his life because of her immense gratitude to him for having corrupted her. She often said to him, "I adore you because you made me a whore." Said in another way, she was right. Florentino Ariza had stripped her of the virginity of a conventional marriage, more pernicious than congenital virginity or the abstinence of widowhood. He had taught her that nothing one does in bed is immoral if it helps to perpetuate love, and something else from that time on would be her reason for living. He convinced her that one comes into the world with a predetermined allotment of lays, and whoever does not use them for whatever reason, one's own or someone else's, willingly or unwillingly, loses them forever. It was to her credit that she took him at his word. Still, because he thought he knew her better than anyone else, Florentino Ariza could not understand why a woman of such puerile resources should be so popular. A woman, moreover, who never stopped talking in bed about the grief she felt for her dead husband. The only explanation that he could think of was one that he could not be denied, was that the Widow Nazareth had enough tenderness to make up for what she lacked in the marital arts. They began to see each other with less frequency as she widened her horizons, and he exploited his, trying to find solace in others' hearts for his pain, and at last, with no sorrow, they forgot each other. Near the top of 152. Got about 10 pages to go, ish. That was Florentino Ariza's first bedroom love, but instead of their forming permanent union of the kind his mother dreamed about, they both used it to embark on a profligate way of life. Florentino Ariza developed methods that seemed incredible in someone like him, taciturn and thin and dressed like an old man from another time. He had two advantages working in his favor, however. One was an unerring eye that promptly spotted the woman, even in a crowd, who was waiting for him. Though even then, he courted her with caution, for he felt that nothing was more embarrassing or more demeaning than a refusal. The other was that women promptly identified him as a solitary man in need of love, a street beggar as humble as a whipped dog, who made them yield without conditions, without asking him for anything, without hoping for anything from him, except the tranquility of knowing they had done him a favor. These were his only weapons, and with them he joined in historic battles of absolute secrecy, which he recorded with the rigor of a notary in a coded book, recognizable among many others by the title that said everything: Women. His first notation was the Widow Nazareth. 50 years later, when Fermina was freed from her sacramental sentence, he had some 25 notebooks with 622 entries of long-term liaisons, apart from the countless fleeting adventures that did not even deserve a charitable note. My God. After 6 months of furious lovemaking with the Widow Nazareth, Florentino Ariza himself was convinced that he had survived the torment of Fermina Daza. He not only believed it, he also discussed it several times with Transito Ariza during the 2 years of Fermina Daza's wedding trip, and he continued to believe it with a feeling of boundless freedom until one fateful Sunday, when, with no warning and no presentiments, he saw her leaving high mass on her husband's arm, besieged by the curiosity and flattery of her new world. The same ladies from fine families who at first had scorned and ridiculed her for being an upstart without a name went out of their way to make her feel like one of them, and she intoxicated them with her charm. She had assumed the condition of the woman of the world to such perfection that Florentino Ariza needed a moment of reflection to recognize her. She was another person, the composure of an older woman, the high boots, the hat of the veil, and colored plume of some oriental bird. Everything about her was distinctive and confident, as if it had been hers from birth. He found her more beautiful and youthful than ever, but more lost to him than she had ever been, although he did not understand why until he saw the curve of her belly under the silk tunic. She was in her 6th month of pregnancy. But what impressed him most was that she and her husband made an admirable couple, and both of them negotiated the world with so much fluidity that they seemed to float above the pitfalls of reality. Florentino Ariza did not feel jealousy or rage, only great contempt for himself. He felt poor, ugly, inferior, and unworthy not only of her, but of any other woman on the face of the earth. So she had returned. She came back without any reason to repent of the sudden changes she had made in her life. On the contrary, she had fewer and fewer such reasons, above all after surviving the difficulties of the early years, which was especially admirable in her case. For she had come to her wedding night still trailing clouds of innocence. She had begun to lose them during her journey through cousin Hildebranda's province, In Valle du Par, she realized why the roosters chased the hens. She witnessed the brutal ceremony of the burrows, she watched the birth of calves, and she listened to her cousins talking with great naturalness about which couples in the family still made love and which ones had stopped, and when and why, and even though they continued to live together. That was when she was initiated into solitary love, with the strange sensation of discovering something that her instincts had always known. First in bed, holding her breath, she would not give herself away in the bedroom. She shared with half a dozen cousins, and then with eagerness and unconcern, sprawling on the bathroom floor, her hair loose, smoking her first mule driver's cigarette. She always did it with certain pangs of conscience, which she could overcome only after she was married, and always in absolute secrecy. Although her cousins boasted to each other not only about the number of orgasms they had in one day, but even about their form and size. But despite those bewitching first rites, she was still burdened by the belief that the loss of virginity was a bloody sacrifice. So that her wedding, one of the most spectacular of the final years of the last century, was for her the prelude to horror. The anguish of the honeymoon affected her much more than the social uproar caused by her marriage to the most incomparably elegant young man of the day. When the banns were announced to High Mass in the cathedral, Fermina Daza received anonymous letters, some of them containing death threats, but she took scant notice of them because all the fear of which she was capable was centered on her imminent violation. Although that was not her intention, it was the correct way to respond to anonymous letters from a class accustomed to the fronts of history to bow before fates accomplis. I assume that's like Latin or French. So that little by little they swallowed their opposition as it became clear that the marriage was irrevocable. She noticed the gradual changes in the attention paid her by livid women, degraded by arthritis and resentment, who one day were convinced of the uselessness of their intrigues and appeared unannounced in the little park of the Evangels as if it were their own home, bearing recipes and engagement gifts. Transito Ariza knew that world, although this was the only time it caused her suffering in her own person, and she knew that her clients always reappeared on the eve of great parties to ask her please to dig down into their jars and lend them their pawned jewels for only 24 hours in exchange for the payment of additional interest. It had been a long while since this had occurred to the extent it did now. The jars emptied so that ladies with long last names could emerge from their shadowy sanctuaries and radiant in their own borrowed jewels, appear at a wedding more splendid than any would have been seen for the rest of the century, and whose ultimate glory was the sponsorship of Dr. Rafael Nunez, who 3 times the President of the Republic, philosopher, poet, and author of the worlds, to the national anthem, as anyone could learn from that time on in some of the more recent dictionaries. My God, that was a really long sentence. Fermina Daza came to the main altar of the cathedral on the arm of her father, whose formal dress lent him for the day an ambiguous air of respectability. She was married forever at the main altar of the cathedral, with a mass at which 3 bishops officiated at 11 o'clock in the morning on the day of the Holy Trinity, without a single charitable thought for Florentino Ariza, who at the hour was delirious with fever, dying because of her, lying without shelter on a boat that was not to carry him to forgetting. During the ceremony, and later at the reception, she wore a smile that seemed painted on with white lead, a soulless grimace that some interpreted as a mocking smile of victory, but in reality was her poor attempt at disguising the terror of a virgin bride. It was fortunate that unforeseen circumstances, combined with her husband's understanding, resolved the first 3 nights without pain. It was providential. The ship of the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, its itinerary upset by bad weather in the Caribbean, announced only 3 days in advance that its departure had been moved ahead by 24 hours, that it would not sail for La Rochelle on the day following the wedding, as it had been planned for the past 6 months, but on that same night. No one believed that the change was not another of the many elegant surprises the wedding had to offer, for the reception ended after midnight on board the brightly lit ocean liner with a Viennese orchestra that was premiering the most recent waltzes by Johann Strauss on this voyage. so that various members of the wedding party, soggy with champagne, had to be dragged ashore by their long-suffering wives when they began to ask the stewards if there were any free cabins so they could continue the celebration all the way to Paris. The last to leave saw Lorenzo Daza outside the Port Tavern, sitting on the ground in the middle of the street, his tuxedo in ruins. He was crying with tremendous loud wails, the way Arabs cry for their dead, sitting in a trickle of fouled water that might have been the pool of tears. Not on the first night on rough seas, or on the following nights of smooth sailing, or even in her very long married life, did the barbarous acts occur that Fermina Daza had feared. Despite the size of the ship and the luxuries of their stateroom, the first night was a horrible repetition of the schooner trip from Riohacha, and her husband, a diligent physician, did not sleep at all so he could comfort her, which was all that an overly distinguished physician knew how to do for seasickness. But the storm abated on the third day after the port of Cholera, and by that time they had spent so much time together and talked so much that they felt like old friends. On the fourth night, when both resumed their ordinary habits, Dr. Juvenal Urbino was surprised that his young wife did not pray before going to sleep. She was frank with him. The duplicity of the nuns had provoked in her a certain resistance to rituals, but her faith was intact, and she had learned to maintain it in silence. She said, "I prefer direct communication with God." He understood her reasoning, and from then on, each practiced the same religion in their own way. They had a brief engagement, but rather informal one for that time. Dr. Urbino had visited her house without a chaperone every day at sunset. She would not have permitted him to touch even the fingertips before the episcopal blessing, but he had not attempted to. It was on the first night, when they were in bed, but still dressed, that he began his caresses with so much care that his suggestion that she put on the nightdress seemed natural to her. She went into the bathroom to change, but first she turned out the lights in the stateroom, and when she came out in her chemise, she covered the cracks around the door with articles of clothing so that she could return to bed in absolute darkness. And she did so, she said with good humor. "What do you expect, Doctor? This is the first time I have slept with a stranger." Dr. Urbino felt her slide in next to him like a startled little animal trying to keep as far away as possible in a bunk where it was difficult for two people to be together without touching. He took her hand, cold and twitching with terror, and entwined his fingers with hers, and almost in a whisper he began to recount his recollections of other ocean voyages. She was tense again because when she came back to bed, she realized that he had taken off all the clothes while she was in the bathroom, which revived the terror of what was to come. But what was to come took several hours, for Dr. Urbino continued talking very slowly as he won her body's confidence millimeter by millimeter. He spoke to her of Paris, of love in Paris, of the lovers in Paris who kissed on the street, on the omnibus, and the flowering terraces of the cafes opened to the burning winds and languid accordions of summer, who made love standing up on the quays of the Seine without anyone disturbing them. As he spoke in the darkness, he caressed the curve of her neck with his fingertips. He caressed the fine, silky hair on her arms, her evasive belly, when he felt that her tension had given way. He made his first attempt to raise her nightgown, but she stopped him with an impulse typical of her character. She said, "I know how to do it myself." She took it off. In fact, then she was so still that Dr. Urbino might have thought she was no longer there, if it had not been for the glint of her body in the darkness. Near the top of 157, getting close. After a while, he took her hand again, and this time it was warm and relaxed, but still moist with the tender dew. They were silent and unmoving for a while longer, and he looking for the opportunity to take the next step, and she waiting for it without knowing where it would come from, while the darkness expanded as their breathing grew more and more intense. Without warning, he let go of her hand and made his leap into the void. He wet the tip of his forefinger with his tongue and grazed her nipple when it was caught off guard, and she felt a mortal explosion, as if he had touched a raw nerve. She was glad of the darkness, so he could not see the searing blush that took her all the way to the base of her skull. "Don't worry," he said with great calm. "Don't forget that I've met them already." He felt her smile, and her voice was sweet and new in the darkness. "I remember it very well," she said, "and I'm still angry." Then he knew that they had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and he took her large, soft hand again and covered it with forlorn kisses. First the hard metacarpus, the long discerning fingers, the diaphanous nails, and then the hieroglyphics of her destiny on her perspiring palm. He never knew how her hand came to his chest and felt something it could not decipher. He said, "It is a scapular." He caressed the hairs on his chest. She caressed the hairs on his chest one by one and then seized all of the hair in a fist to pull it out by the roots. "Harder," she said. He tried until she knew she was not hurting him, and then it was her hand that sought his, lost in the darkness. But he did not allow the fingers to intertwine. Instead, he grasped hers by the wrist and moved her hand along his body with an invisible but well-directed strength until she felt the ardent breath of a naked animal without bodily form, but eager and erect. Contrary to what he had imagined, even contrary to what she herself had imagined, she did not withdraw her hand or let it lie inert where he placed it, but instead she commended herself, body and soul, to the Blessed Virgin, clenched her teeth for fear she would laugh out loud at her own madness, and began to identify her rearing adversary by touch, discovering its size, the strength of its shaft, the extension of its wings, and amazed by its determination, but pitying its solitude, making it her own with a detailed curiosity that someone less experienced than her husband might have confused with caresses. He summoned all his reserves of strength to overcome the vertigo of her implacable scrutiny, until he released it with childish unconcern, as if she were tossing it into the trash. "I have never been able to understand how that thing works," she said. This is very, descriptive, but in, a tasteful way. Near the top of 158. Then, with authoritative methodology, he explained it to her in all seriousness while he moved her hand to the places he mentioned, and she allowed it to be moved with the obedience of an exemplary pupil. At a propitious moment, he suggested that all of this was easier in the light. He was going to turn it on, but she held his arm, saying, "I see better with my hands." In reality, she wanted to turn on the light as well, but she really wanted to be the one to do it, without anyone's ordering her to, and she had it her way. Then he saw her in the sudden brightness, huddled in the fetal position under the sheet, but he watched as she grasped the animal under study without hesitation, turning it this way and that, observed it with an interest that was beginning to seem more than scientific, and said when she was finished, "How ugly it is, even uglier than a woman's thing." He agreed and pointed out other disadvantages more serious than ugliness. He said, "It is like a firstborn son. You spend your life working for him, sacrificing everything for him, and at the moment of truth he does just as he pleases." She continued to examine it, asking what this was for and what that was for, and when she felt satisfied with her information, she hefted it in both hands to confirm that it did not weigh enough to bother her with, and let it drop with a gesture of disdain. "Besides, I think it has too many things on it," she said. He was astounded. The original thesis of his dissertation had been just that, the advantage of simplifying the human organism. It seemed antiquated to him, with many useless or duplicated functions that had been essential in other stages of the human race, but were not in ours. Yes, it could be more simple, and by the same token, less vulnerable, he concluded. It is something that only God can do, of course, but in any event, it would be good to have it established in theoretical terms. She laughed with an amusement and so much naturalness that he took advantage of the opportunity to embrace and kiss her for the first time on the mouth. She responded, and continued giving her very soft kisses on the cheeks, her nose, her eyelids, while he slipped his hand under the sheet and caressed her flat, straight pubic hair, the pubic hair of a Japanese. She did not move his hand away, but she kept hers on the alert in the event that he took one step further. "Let's not go on with the medical lesson," she said. "No," he said, "this is going to be a lesson in love." Then he pulled down the sheet, and she not only did not object, but kicked it away from the bunk with a rapid movement of her feet, because she could no longer bear the heat. Her body was undulant and elastic, much more serious than it appeared when dressed, when its own scent of a forest animal which distinguished her from all the other women in the world. Defenseless in the light, she felt a rush of blood surge up to her face, and the only way she could think of to hide it was to throw her arms around her husband's neck and give him a hard, thorough kiss that lasted until they were both gasping for breath. He was aware that he did not love her. He had married her because he liked her haughtiness, her seriousness, her strength, and also because of some vanity on his part. But as she kissed him for the first time, he was sure there would be no obstacle to their inventing true love. They did not speak of it that first night, when they spoke of everything until dawn, nor would they ever speak of it, but in the long run neither of them had made a mistake. At dawn, when they fell asleep, she was still a virgin, but she would not be one much longer. The following night, in fact, after he taught her how to dance Viennese waltzes under the starry Caribbean sky, he went to the bathroom after she did, and when he returned to the stateroom he found her waiting for him naked in the bed. Then it was she who took the initiative and gave herself, without fear, without regret, with the joy of an adventure on the high seas, and with no traces of bloody ceremony except for the rose of honor on the sheet. They both made love well, almost as if by miracle, and they continued to make love well night and day, and better each time for the rest of the voyage. And when they reached La Rochelle, they got along as if they were old lovers. They stayed in Europe, with Paris as their base, and made short trips to neighboring countries. During that time, they made love every day, more than once on winter Sundays, when they frolicked in bed until it was time for lunch. He was a man of strong impulses, and well-disciplined besides, and she was not one to let anyone take advantage of her, so they had been content with sharing power in bed. After 3 months of feverish love-making, he concluded that one of them was sterile, and they both submitted to rigorous examinations at the Hôpital de la Salpêtrière, where he had been an intern. It was an arduous but fruitless effort. However, when they least expected it, and with no scientific intervention, the miracle occurred. When they returned home, Fermina was in the 6th month of her pregnancy and thought herself the happiest woman on earth. The child they had both longed for was both without incident, under the sign of Aquarius, and baptized in honor of the grandfather who had died of cholera. It was impossible to know if it was Europe or love that changed them, for both occurred at the same time. They were in essence not only between themselves, but with everyone else, just as Florentino Ariza perceived them when he saw them leaving Mass 2 weeks after their return on that Sunday of his misfortune. They came back with a new conception of life, bringing with them the latest trends in the world and ready to lead, he with the most recent developments in literature, music, and above all in his science. He had a subscription to Le Figaro, so he would not lose touch with reality, and another to the Revue du Monde, so that he would not lose touch with poetry. He had also arranged with his bookseller in Paris to receive works by the most widely read authors, among them Anatole France and Pierre Loti, and by those he liked best, including Remy de Gourmont and Paul Bourget. Under no circumstances anything by Émile Zola, whom he found intolerable despite his valiant intervention in the Dreyfus affair. The same bookseller agreed to mail him the most attractive scores of the Riccardi catalog, chamber music above all, so that he could maintain the well-deserved title earned by his father as the greatest friend of concerts in the city. Bottom of 160. Fermina Daza, always resistant to the demands of fashion, brought back 6 trunks of clothing from different periods, for the great labels did not convince her. She had been in the Tuileries in the middle of winter for the launching of the collection by Worth, the indisputable tyrant of haute couture, and the only thing she got was a case of bronchitis that kept her in bed for 5 days. La Fière seemed less pretentious and vicarious to her, but her wise decision was to buy her fill of what she liked best in the second-hand shops, although her husband swore in dismay that it was corpses' clothing. In the same way, she brought back quantities of Italian shoes without brand names, which she preferred to the renowned and famous shoes by Fairy. She brought back a parasol from Dupuis, as red as the fires of hell, which gave our alarmed social chroniclers much to write about. She bought only 1 hat from Madame Ribou, but on the other hand, she filled a trunk with sprigs of artificial cherries, stalks of all the felt flowers she could find, branches of ostrich plumes, crests of peacocks' tail feathers, and Asiatic roasters, entire pheasants, hummingbirds, and and a countless variety of exotic birds preserved in mid-flight, mid-call, mid-agony, everything that had been used in the past 20 years to change the appearance of hats. She brought back a collection of fans from countries all over the world, each one appropriate to a different occasion. She brought back a disturbing fragrance chosen from many at the perfume shop in the Bazaar de la Charité before the spring winds leveled everything with ashes, but she used it only once because she did not recognize herself in the new scent. She also brought back a cosmetic case that was the latest thing in seductiveness, and she took it to parties at a time when the simple act of checking someone's makeup in public was considered indecent. They also brought back 3 indelible memories: the unprecedented opening of the Tales of Hoffmann in Paris, the terrifying blaze that destroyed almost all the gondolas off St. Mark's Square in Venice, which they witnessed with grieving hearts from the window of their hotel at their fleeting glimpse of Oscar Wilde during their first snowfall in January. But amid these and so many other memories, Dr. Juvenal Urbino had one that he always regretted not sharing with his wife, for it came from his days as a bachelor student in Paris. It was the memory of Victor Hugo, who enjoyed an impassioned fame here and had nothing to do with his books, because someone said that he had said, although no one had actually heard him say it, that our Constitution was meant for a nation not of men, but of angels. From that time on, special homage was paid to him, and for most of our many compatriots who traveled to France went out of their way to see him. A half-dozen students, among them Juvenal Urbino, stood guard for a time outside his residence on Avenue Edieu at the cafes, where it was said that he came without fail and never came, and at last they sent a written request for a private audience in the name of the Angels of the Constitution de Rio Negro. They never received a reply. One day, when Juvenal Urbino happened to be passing the Luxembourg Gardens, he saw him come out of the Senate with a young woman on his arm. He seemed very old. He walked with difficulty, his beard and hair were less brilliant than in his pictures, and he wore an overcoat that seemed to belong to a larger man. He did not want to ruin the memory with an impertinent greeting. He was satisfied with the almost unreal vision that he would keep for the rest of his life. When he returned to Paris as a married man in a position to see him under more formal circumstances, Victor Hugo had already died. Oh. As a consolation, Juvenal Urbino and Fermina Daza brought back the shared memory of a snowy afternoon where they were intrigued by a crowd that defied the storm outside a small bookshop on the Boulevard de Capucines that Oscar Wilde was inside. When he came out at last, elegant indeed, but perhaps too conscious of being so, the group surrounded him, asking that he sign their books. Dr. Urbino had stopped just to watch him, but his impulsive wife wanted to cross the boulevard so that he could sign the only thing she thought appropriate. Given the fact that she did not have a book, her beautiful gazelle skin glove, long, smooth, soft, same color as her newlywed skin, she was sure that a man as refined as he would appreciate the gesture, but her husband objected with firmness, and when she tried to go despite his arguments, he did not feel he could survive the embarrassment. "If you cross that street," he said to her, "when you get back here, you will find me dead." Oh my gosh. It was something natural in her, because she had been married a year. She moved through the world with the same assurance that had been hers as a little girl in the wilds of San Juan de la Ciénaga, as if she had been born with it. And she had a facility for dealing with strangers that left her husband dumbfounded, and a mysterious talent for making herself understood in Spanish with anyone, anywhere. "You have to know languages when you go to sell something," she said, with mocking laughter. "But when you go to buy, everyone does what he must to understand you." It was difficult to imagine anyone who could have assimilated the daily life of Paris with so much speed and so much joy, and who learned to love her memory of it despite the eternal rain. Nevertheless, when she returned home overwhelmed by so many experiences, tired of traveling, drowsy with her pregnancy, the first thing she asked in the port was what she thought of the marvels of Europe, and she summed up many months of bliss with 4 words of Caribbean slang: "It's not so much." Cheeky. And that is the end of chapter 3.